Under the waning glow of a Roman sunset in 64 AD, the city that had stood for centuries as the beating heart of an empire began to tremble under the weight of its own destruction. Flames licked the sky, reflecting off the marble temples and wooden rooftops, a living inferno that would later etch itself into the memory of human history. But this is not merely the story of the Great Fire of Rome. It is a story of power, paranoia, myth, and the strange way legends outlive truth. For centuries, one question has burned even hotter than the fire itself. Did Emperor Nero really fiddle while Rome burned? To answer that, we must step into the world of ancient Rome, a metropolis of grandeur and contradiction. By the mid-first century, the city was an intricate tapestry of wealth and squalor, home to more than 1 million souls. Its senators lived among colonnaded villas, while its masses crowded into wooden tenements stacked like precarious towers. Fires were no stranger to this city built of timber and ambition. Oil lamps, cooking hearths, straw roofs, Rome was a tinderbox long before the summer of 64. Nero at this time was 30 years old, reigning for nearly a decade. He was not the brutish caricature history often paints. When he came to power, guided by his mother Agrippina and his brilliant tutor Seneca, many celebrated the dawn of a golden age. He abolished certain taxes, banned unnecessary executions, and fancied himself a patron of the arts. He wanted to be loved, not feared. Yet, beneath the gilded performances and artistic pretensions, Nero was a man trapped between the expectations of empire and the theater of his own mind. In early July of that fateful year, the heat hung over Rome like an omen. Cicadas sang through the night, and the Cicero gardens glowed with fireflies, as if mimicking small fires of their own. Then, in the lower districts near the Circus Maximus, an immense chariot racing arena surrounded by wooden shops selling oil, fabrics, and grain, a spark may have been all it took. No one could later agree on the exact cause. Some blamed carelessness from merchants, others later whispered of sabotage. What began as a small blaze in the densely packed insulae soon spiraled beyond anyone's control. Wind swept through the narrow streets, carrying burning debris across rooftops. Within hours, half of Rome's neighborhoods were aflame. At the time, Nero was not in the city but at his villa in Antium, a seaside retreat about 30 miles away. The first messengers reached him as the fire raged into its second day. Accounts diverge on what happened next. Tacitus, writing decades later, offered a relatively balanced version. Nero returned at once and threw open his private gardens to shelter refugees. He organized food supplies and arranged emergency relief. To the exhausted and terrified population, he presented the image of a leader trying to protect his city. Yet rumors spread faster than the fire itself. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, after nearly a week, 2/3 of Rome had been reduced to ash. Plebeian homes, temples, and markets lay in ruin. The statues of gods leaned blackened and headless amid the rubble. Many believed the fire had been too well fed, too widespread to be mere chance. Some survivors claimed they'd been stopped by strange men during the chaos, men who declared they had authorization to keep spreading the flames, and whispers started to gather around the emperor himself. Why? They asked. Why would Nero destroy his own city? One story said he had wished to rebuild Rome in his own image, a vision of marble and splendor called Neropolis. Another story, far darker and more enduring, said that while the city burned, Nero stood on a tower in his palace, looking out over the inferno, playing his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction as if the tragedy were some private performance. It is one of history's most haunting images, the emperor serenading catastrophe. But history often lies through poetry. The tale of Nero fiddling as Rome burned, though unforgettable, rests on imagination more than fact. For one thing, fiddles, or violins, did not exist in ancient Rome. The instrument he supposedly played was a lyre. More crucially, our main source for the story comes not from eyewitnesses, but from later historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, who despised Nero and wrote years after his death. Tacitus himself carefully phrased his account, saying only that Nero used the occasion of the fire to display his theatrical talents, implying not that he caused it, but that he could not resist turning disaster into drama. Still, myth grew like ivy around truth, and Nero did not help his own case. Once the ashes cooled, he seized the opportunity to reshape the capital. Vast swaths of confiscated land were cleared to make way for his audacious architectural dream, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. Covering more than 100 acres at the heart of the city, it was an opulent labyrinth of marble halls, shimmering gold tiles, perfumed fountains, rotating dining rooms, and an enormous statue of Nero himself as the sun god. For the homeless citizens staring at their emperor's new palace rising from the ruins of their homes, the message seemed unmistakable. To deflect growing suspicion, Nero turned to find a scapegoat. And in the diverse, layered population of Rome, he found one group particularly easy to blame: the Christians. A small, secretive sect, still largely misunderstood by Roman society, they refused to honor the emperor or participate in state rituals. Rumors circulated that they engaged in dark ceremonies, drinking blood and eating flesh, the misinterpreted symbols of communion. To accuse them of arson fit neatly into an existing prejudice. Tacitus later wrote that Nero fastened the guilt upon the Christians, subjecting them to unspeakable cruelty. What followed was one of the earliest and most brutal persecutions of Christians in Rome. Some were torn apart by dogs in public arenas. Others were crucified, or, infamously, set alight at night to serve as human torches in Nero's gardens. He even illuminated his games with them, wrote Tacitus, when the daylight had expired. It is an image as horrific as any conjured by the fire that started it all, the light of innocent bodies replacing the light of the fallen city. Nero's popularity, at least among the common people, initially survived. Many were fed and entertained. The emperor's lavish spectacles became a balm for despair. Yet the Senate, the aristocracy, and the historians who would later record his reign saw in him only vanity and corruption. For them, Nero's love of art and theater mocked the gravitas of Roman power. He dared appear on stage as an actor, compete in public races, and sing before audiences, actions considered beneath an emperor. He would rather be admired as an artist than obeyed as a ruler, sniffed one chronicler. And in time, that preference would be his undoing. Over the next 4 years, Nero's rule stumbled toward its tragic finale. Revolts erupted across his provinces. His closest allies fell. Seneca was forced to commit suicide under imperial orders, accused of conspiracy. Even Poppaea, his wife, was said to have died by his own impulsive hand. By 68 AD, Rome's patience was. The legions in Gaul and Hispania rose in rebellion, proclaiming new emperors. Deserted by his guards and declared a public enemy, Nero fled the city he had once adorned in gold. On a humid June morning, cornered in a villa outside Rome, he realized the end had come. Qualis artifex pereo. What an artist dies in me, he reportedly murmured before driving a dagger into his neck. With that final theatrical line, Nero ended both his life and the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Rome would never again trust an emperor so indulgent in the spectacle of himself. But the fire he left behind, not the one that consumed wood and stone, but the one that consumed his memory, burned for centuries. Later emperors would use him as a warning, a symbol of decadence and divine punishment. Christians enshrined him as the first great persecutor, a monstrous figure whispered about in apocalyptic terms. Some even came to believe he had not truly died, that he would return in vengeance. The myth of Nero lived on in art, literature, and legend, casting shadows far longer than his actual reign. If we return to that terrible night in 64 AD, what should we imagine instead of the melodramatic emperor strumming a lyre amid the flames? Perhaps a man pacing through corridors of smoke and confusion, half terrified, half fascinated by disaster, the performer in him unable to look away from the city's own cruel theater. Perhaps he stood atop a terrace, not to serenade destruction, but to watch what he could not control, feeling the strange mixture of horror and awe that only those who rule can feel when they realize their power has limits. For all his vanity and flaws, Nero was not the only actor that night. Rome itself played its part, with wooden beams collapsing like scenery and citizens crying out as if in tragedy. The city would be rebuilt. Under his architects, streets were widened, walls made from fireproof stone, and building codes, rudimentary but revolutionary, were imposed for the first time. In a twisted irony, The destruction led to the Rome we recognize in miniature models and ruins today. The grand avenues, the organized grid, the stone that endured. Catastrophe, in its own grim way, shaped progress. By late antiquity, the story of Nero had swollen into something far greater than a record of one emperor's failings. He became an embodiment of corruption itself, invoked by moralists and preachers across millennia. Medieval chroniclers interpreted the Great Fire as divine retribution. Renaissance playwrights turned Nero into a symbol of tyranny. Modern historians, peeling back the layers, found the frightened young ruler within the monster's costume. As our distance from Rome grows, the line between myth and man becomes harder to see. Interpreting history is like sifting ash for bones. We find fragments, never the whole. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio all wrote with agendas shaped by their own times. Archaeology reveals traces carbonized foundations near the Circus Maximus, confirms something immense did burn in 64, but they cannot tell us whose hand held the torch. In the end, the most enduring truth might not be the factual one, but the emotional one. That civilizations build their identities not from what truly happened, but from the stories they choose to believe about themselves. Rome needed Nero to be the villain so that it could redeem its own past from the fire. Even centuries later, the symbolism persisted. In the Middle Ages, troubadours recited tales of Nero playing as flames consumed the world, a warning to rulers who loved art more than duty. Painters of the Renaissance remade him as the archetype of decadent kingship, robed in crimson while chaos raged around him. In the 19th century, Victor Hugo invoked Nero as the eternal example of despotism born from vanity. And even today, the phrase, fiddling while Rome burns, survives as a universal warning for neglect, for arrogance, for the blindness of power in crisis. But to reduce Nero to a single gesture is to miss what makes his story so enduring. He represents the tension between art and authority, between creation and destruction, that humankind still wrestles with. Nero was not the only ruler whose dreams for beauty led to ruin, nor the last leader accused of spectacle amid suffering. His fire may be ancient, but the lesson it illuminated, how quickly admiration turns to hatred, how easily image obscures truth, remains startlingly modern. Imagine then the scene one last time, the dark sky over ancient Rome, pierced by columns of fire. The Colline Gate sealed, refugees crowding the open fields beyond the Tiber, voices carrying prayers to gods that would not answer, soldiers forming ad hoc brigades, beating at burning rooftops with wet cloths. Amid that confusion strides a slight, pale man, the youngest emperor Rome ever had, calling out orders, coughing on smoke, caught between guilt and performance. His eyes reflect the inferno the way an actor reflects the light of a stage. Perhaps for one brief, haunted moment, Nero truly did begin to sing. Not in mockery, but in mourning, for the city, for himself, for a destiny already slipping through his hands. The Great Fire ended more than a week after it began. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained mostly untouched. 9 were entirely scorched. Yet in a matter of years, a new city rose upon the ashes. Marble replaced timber, avenues uncoiled in order and symmetry. Within a generation, Nero's name would be cursed, then mythologized, then dissected by historians who never smelled the smoke he breathed. The ruins of his golden house, excavated centuries later by Renaissance diggers, revealed frescoes so vivid and fantastical that they redefined art itself. Renaissance artists, Michelangelo, Raphael, and others, descended into those buried chambers and studied the designs painted for the emperor's doomed paradise. What they found sparked Europe's imagination and gave us the very word grotesque, derived from grotta, or cave. Those vaulted, forgotten halls of Nero's palace. Even in disgrace, Nero's aesthetic vision reshaped the art of a world that had long outlived him. Perhaps that is the strangest twist of all, that the man condemned as a destroyer became, inadvertently, a muse for beauty centuries later. Such ironies echo through the corridors of time. History rarely grants simple verdicts. It leaves behind mosaics of contradictions. Nero was both tyrant and visionary, criminal and patron, destroyer and creator, and in those contradictions, we glimpse something profoundly human. From the smoldering streets of ancient Rome, a pattern repeats across ages. Disaster becomes story, story becomes memory, memory becomes myth, and somewhere between those transformations, the living truth flickers like a candle, fragile, elusive, fleeting. If you stand today upon the Palatine Hill and look outward across the modern city, nothing visible remains of that night's terror. Traffic hums where the Circus Maximus once roared with flame. The marble of the Colosseum gleams under electric light, yet beneath the soil lies that layer of ash-sealed testimony to the night when Rome nearly devoured itself. Archaeologists, brushing the blackened fragments, uncover not merely ruins, but echoes. The fear of citizens who ran through choking smoke, the ambition of an emperor who wanted to outshine them all, the paradox of a civilization that burned itself into immortality. The question, did Nero really play while Rome burned, will never be answered with certainty. But in a deeper sense, it hardly matters. He played before and after, in palaces and theaters, in pageantry and in punishment. The performance was his life, the stage his empire. And when the curtain finally fell, the audience, Rome and the world beyond, continued watching for 2,000 years. In the end, perhaps we can imagine the fire not as an act of evil or divine wrath, but as a mirror held to human ambition. Every empire, ancient or modern, carries within it the seeds of its own blaze. Each generation looks back and sees in Nero the embodiment of its worst fears, that power without restraint becomes art without meaning, that spectacle without empathy turns beauty into ruin. The legend of Nero endures because it speaks to the dangers that still haunt us, of creation lost to excess, of responsibility abandoned to vanity, of leaders who mistake applause for loyalty. So, as the embers of that long-vanished city fade, what remains is not condemnation, nor absolution, but reflection. The great fire of Rome was, in its way, both an end and a beginning. The death of one Rome, the birth of another, and the forging of a story whose smoke still drifts through the corridors of history. Perhaps the only fitting conclusion is the one history itself seems to offer, that Rome rose from its own ashes, as it always had, and that in every civilization's darkest night there flickers both destruction and rebirth. Centuries later, the legend continues to glow, not in flame, but in memory. Someone tells the tale of Nero once more, and for a moment the fire burns again, not in the streets of Rome, but in the imagination of everyone who hears it. The light it casts is no longer one of destruction, but of understanding, that we are all in some way standing at the edge of our own empires, watching the fires we inherit, wondering what stories the future will choose to remember.